Every time you grab a tub labeled Greek yogurt off the supermarket shelf, you're probably assuming it went through the same slow, traditional straining process that gave the product its name in the first place. Here's the part almost nobody knows. The word Greek, sitting right there on the front of the tub in bold letters, isn't a protected or legally defined term in Australia. There's no inspector checking whether that tub was actually strained. Today we're pulling apart the yogurt aisle across the major chains to find out which tubs are giving you real strained protein and which ones are using thickeners to fake the whole experience. It's a strange blind spot when you actually stop and think about it. We're generally used to food labels meaning something. A product can't call itself organic without meeting an audited standard. It can't claim to be gluten-free without meeting a defined threshold. But a word borrowed from an entire country's culinary tradition, describing a specific manufacturing process that takes real time and real milk, gets to sit on a tub with essentially no verification behind it at all. That gap between how confident the label sounds and how little legal weight it actually carries is exactly what we're spending the next 20 minutes unpacking. We buy yogurt because it feels like the responsible choice. It goes in the breakfast bowl, gets blended into smoothies, gets handed to kids as the healthy snack option instead of something sweeter. And walking down the chilled aisle, every tub is doing its best to reinforce that feeling. Rustic fonts, pastoral imagery, words like authentic and traditional stacked across the lid, sometimes with an illustration of rolling hills that has nothing to do with where the milk actually came from. What's actually happening on the ingredients panel tells a different story a lot of the time. Food manufacturers have gotten very good at simulating the thick, rich texture that traditional straining produces, using cheaper dairy solids, stabilizers, and starches instead of the time and milk volume that real straining requires. This isn't a new trick either. Food scientists have been refining texture mimicking techniques for decades across all sorts of categories, from low-fat spreads that feel like butter to plant-based products chasing the mouthfeel of dairy. Yogurt is just one of the more visible examples, because the difference between the real process and the shortcut version is unusually easy to spot once you know what to look for. And once you start comparing protein content against price per tub, the gap between what you're paying for and what you're actually getting can be substantial. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to walk through why that gap exists, look at the regulatory blind spot that makes it completely legal, work out a simple way to compare protein value across brands, run through how the different tiers on the shelf actually stack up, and finish with a fast way to check any tub before it goes in your trolley. Let's start with the word doing. Most of the heavy lifting on that label, Greek. Traditional Greek yogurt is made by fermenting milk with live bacterial cultures and then straining the finished product through cloth or a fine filter to remove the watery whey. That straining step is the entire point. It's what concentrates the protein, thickens the texture without any additives, and gives real Greek yogurt's dense, almost cream cheese-like consistency. It also uses considerably more milk per tub than regular yogurt does, since you're removing a portion of the liquid volume after fermentation, which is exactly why properly strained yogurt tends to cost more to produce in the first place. Now compare that to what's often labeled Greek style. Rather than straining, some manufacturers add thickening agents directly into a regular yogurt base. Things like modified starch, pectin, gelatin, or milk protein concentrate to mimic that same thick mouthfeel without the time, the extra milk, or the cost of true straining. Visually, on the shelf, the two products can look nearly identical. Structurally, they're built completely differently, and that difference shows up directly in the protein number on the back panel, sometimes by a factor of nearly double between a properly strained tub and a thickened imitation of similar size. None of this is hidden exactly. It's sitting right there in the ingredients list. But ingredient lists are printed small in the back in a font nobody's designed to be exciting, while the front of the pack is doing everything possible to make you stop reading before you get that far. That's not an accident. It's basic packaging psychology. And it works because most of us are moving fast through a grocery run, not conducting an audit. Retail researchers sometimes call this a health halo effect, where a single trusted word or image on packaging causes shoppers to unconsciously assume the entire product meets a higher standard than it actually does, without ever checking the details that would confirm or deny that assumption. A Greek flag motif or a windmill graphic doesn't change a single ingredient, but it changes how quickly you put the tub in your trolley and stop thinking about it. So how is this legal? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the answer isn't a scandal, it's a gap. In Australia, yogurt and other fermented milk products are regulated under the National Food Standards Code, which sets rules around things like requiring live and active cultures, minimum dairy content, and food safety across the fermentation and packaging process. What the code doesn't do is legally define the word Greek as a production method. There's no clause anywhere in Australian food law that says a product can only carry that word if it went through a straining process. The term functions more like a style descriptor than a regulated category, similar to how a bakery can call a loaf artisan without that meaning anything legally enforceable about how it was made, or how a cafe can call a coffee single origin without a government body checking the beans' paperwork. That's a genuine gap, not a conspiracy. Food regulators generally exist to police safety and basic compositional honesty, things like preventing contamination, mandating allergen warnings, and making sure a product genuinely contains what its category name implies at a baseline level. Policing marketing adjectives is a different job entirely, and it's one regulators have generally left to consumer advocacy groups and, increasingly, the choppers themselves reading the fine print. The practical result is that Greek and Greek style can sit next to each other on the same shelf at similar prices, with the second one delivering meaningfully less protein for your money, and neither one is breaking any law. It's worth adding that this isn't unique to Australia either. Regulators in a number of other countries have wrestled with the exact same gap, since the word Greek describes a cultural origin and a texture, not a chemically defined process the way something like pasteurized is. That ambiguity is precisely what gives manufacturers the legal room to use the word so loosely. Which brings us to the part that actually affects your grocery bill, doing the math properly instead of trusting the label to do it for you. The number that actually matters here isn't the price on the shelf tag, it's price per gram of protein. It sounds like overkill for a tub of yogurt, but the calculation takes about 10 seconds. Take the price of the tub, divide it by the total grams of protein in the whole container, using the protein per 100 grams figure on the nutrition panel multiplied by the tub's total weight. What you get is a genuinely comparable number across every brand and format on the shelf, regardless of tub size or serving suggestion. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because thickened, starch-based yogurts are effectively diluting their protein with cheaper filler. You can be paying nearly the same price per tub as a properly strained option while getting a noticeably smaller protein return on that spend. It also exposes a separate trap. Small single-serve tubs almost always carry a higher price per gram of protein than the same yogurt sold in a large tub, because you're paying extra for portioning and packaging convenience, not for additional nutrition. Convenience is a legitimate thing to pay for if your wheat genuinely needs grab-and-go portions, but it's worth knowing that's the actual trade you're making rather than assuming the smaller cup is somehow a smarter or lighter choice nutritionally. There's a second layer to this worth understanding too, which is what happens when manufacturers remove fat from a yogurt. Fat carries a lot of the flavor and mouthfeel in dairy products, so when a low-fat or fat-free version is developed, something usually has to replace that lost sensory experience, and very often that something is sugar, or a starch-based thickener doing double duty as both texture filler and a mild sweetness carrier. That's why a diet or low-fat yogurt can sometimes carry a similar or even higher sugar count than the full-fat version sitting right beside it on the shelf. The fat percentage on the front of the pack is only telling you one part of the nutritional trade that happened during formulation, and it's rarely the part that determines whether the product is actually a smarter choice for you. Once you start running the protein per dollar calculation across a shelf, patterns emerge fast, and they don't always follow the price tag the way you'd expect. Let's work through how the tiers on a typical supermarket shelf actually perform, counting down from the weakest value to the strongest. At the very bottom sit the ultra-budget natural and vanilla tubs, the plain home brand style options sold at the lowest price point in the chiller. These are usually built around regular, unstrained yogurt with a stabilizer or two added purely for shelf stability rather than texture theatre, and the protein count typically sits at the lower end of what you'd find across the entire category. On their own terms, as a mild, inexpensive, everyday ingredient, there's nothing dishonest happening here. The problem only shows up if you're buying one of these expecting Greek-level protein density, because the ingredient list will tell you plainly that it isn't built for that job. Just above that sit the flavoured fruit swirl-style tubs aimed squarely at kids' lunchboxes and quick snacking. These frequently carry noticeably more added sugar than their plain counterparts, sometimes enough that the nutritional profile starts resembling a light dessert more than a protein-forward breakfast food. There's nothing dishonest about sweetened yogurt existing as a category, but it's worth clocking that the healthy snack framing on the front doesn't always match the sugar column on the back, which is exactly the gap that catches out shoppers buying specifically because it feels like the responsible option for their kids. One rung up again are the low-fat and diet-branded variants, which, as we just covered, often quietly replace the fat they've removed with sugar or thickener rather than delivering a straightforward lighter product. These sit in an odd middle position, genuinely lower in fat, sometimes not meaningfully lower in overall calories once the reformulation is accounted for, and rarely a clear upgrade on protein. Moving into the middle of the shelf, you'll find the mid-tier national brands and the Greek-style tubs specifically, and this is genuinely the category where label reading pays off the most. Within this single section, you'll find both authentically strained products with a short, honest ingredient list and thickener-based products charging a similar or even higher price without any straining behind them. There's no shortcut here beyond flipping the tub and checking whether milk and culture are essentially the whole story, or whether starch and gelatin show up further down the list. Two tubs can sit side by side at almost the same price, wearing almost the same font choices, and deliver meaningfully different nutrition depending purely on which manufacturing path was taken. Higher up the value ladder are the specialty and boutique labeled tubs, often positioned with imagery of small batch production or European heritage. Some of these genuinely are strained using traditional methods and justify a chunk of their premium through that process and through higher milk content per tub. Others are leaning almost entirely on branding and imported-sounding names, while using a formulation not meaningfully different from the mid-tier options beneath them. This tier is the hardest to generalize about as a group, because the quality range inside it is wider than any other part of the shelf, which makes the ingredient panel more important here than anywhere else. And at the very top of the value equation, interestingly, it's not always the most expensive tub on the shelf. Properly strained, natural or plain Greek yogurt, even sold under a supermarket's own mid-range or house label, frequently delivers the strongest protein per dollar figure on the entire aisle because it skips both the sugar loading of the flavored tubs and the thickener-based padding of the fake Greek-style options. You're paying for actual concentrated dairy protein rather than flavor engineering or texture mimicry, and because it's plain and unbranded with flashy claims, it often sits at a noticeably lower shelf price than the marketing-heavy specialty tubs beside it. The genuinely strongest move, cost and nutrition-wise, is usually the least decorated tub on the shelf, not the most photogenic one. That's a useful thing to sit with for a second because it inverts the instinct most of us walk in with. The tub working hardest to convince you it's authentic is frequently the one that needs the marketing precisely because the ingredient list can't do that convincing on its own. So here's the fast version you can actually use standing in the aisle in under 30 seconds without needing your phone calculator. First, flick the tub and read the ingredients in order, since they're listed from most to least by weight. If milk and live cultures are essentially the entire list, you're likely looking at a genuinely strained product. If modified starch, gelatin, pectin, or milk protein concentrate appear anywhere near the top, you're looking at a thickened imitation, whatever the front of the pack claims. This one check alone does more work than almost anything else you can do standing in that aisle. Second, check the protein figure per 100 grams on the nutrition panel. Properly strained Greek yogurt typically sits meaningfully higher than regular or Greek-style yogurt in that column. So if a tub calling itself Greek is sitting close to the protein level of a plain regular yogurt, that's a strong signal the texture is coming from additives rather than straining, regardless of how thick it looks through the tub. Third, do a rough mental price per protein check rather than trusting the shelf price alone, especially when comparing a small single-serve cup against a larger tub of the same style, since the smaller format is almost always the worst deal per gram of actual protein. And if you want a physical confirmation on top of the label check, a spoon drag through genuinely strained yogurt will hold a clean groove and move slowly. Where a starch-thickened version tends to slump back and level itself out within a few seconds, a rough but useful clue about which process actually produced the texture in your hand. Run these 3 checks and you've effectively done what took us this entire investigation to explain, just compressed into the time it takes to read a label. The yogurt aisle isn't secretly dishonest. It's just built to reward shoppers who don't look past the front of the pack. And that's a very different thing. Once you know that Greek is a style word rather than a legal guarantee, that thickeners are doing the texture work cheaper products can't do naturally, and that price per gram of protein tells you more than the shelf tag ever will, the whole category stops being a guessing game. The tub with the windmill on the label and the tub with almost nothing printed on it at all can hold the exact same milk and cultures inside, and now you're one of the people who can actually tell the difference before you've paid for it. So tell me, what's currently sitting in your fridge? And after today, does it earn its spot back in your trolley next time? Drop it in the comments. And if you want us to put another everyday supermarket staple through the same kind of test, subscribe, because there's another aisle getting the same treatment next week.